afternoon, we will be having a discussion on reimagining leadership. Sharon, do we have the Mentimeter? No? Okay. That is fine. We will have a Mentimeter come up because I think it's important that we do a mapping of what are the leadership programs on the continent right now and who is hosting those leadership programs. And could we possibly get into a time where we are collaborating more closely and sharing our expertise across regions and across nations? So we're going to have a Mentimeter go up. There's a third question we could add, but we're going to keep it brief. It's, which of those leadership programs have been meaningful and how have we applied them? And we're hoping together in this room as practitioners, we will be collaborating and coordinating going forward. So Deus will be moderating our conversation this afternoon. And I think we had a practitioner, historian, stroke, a Pan-Africanist dreamer speak, Honorable Shabalala, in as much as his many other things, who spoke the realities that we sometimes do not speak about. Then we had the political, where we had the Afrobarometer study. And with studies, they are in many ways structured around Western epistemology. What that means is that it has to be scientific. It needs footnotes. You need to prove the methodology that you used. And yet, there are so many results that we have that we know are impactful that it would take us 10 years just to write down exactly the methodology and footnote it and all of that. And so part of the question we are raising in the room, or that we want us to be thinking about, is what's the meeting point of the political science and theory that we know and hold true versus what we see working? And when we look at what we see working, let's ask ourselves, why has the anti-genderized movement, why is it actually working? Why is it growing? Why is the fascist movement growing? Why is it someone that we know is a charlatan able to make it into these esteemed offices? Why isn't the political science working? And between what we know is the reality and our political scientific theories, somewhere in the middle, we probably have the answer. The other thing to think about is we've been very good at documenting our policies and legal frameworks and saying what we want and articulating them in the borrowed languages of English, Arabic, French, and that was said this morning. What fails them? Why aren't they able to deliver what needs to be delivered? And we believe part of that answer has got to do with the leadership praxis itself. Because at the end of the day, they say institutions are run by people, right? There are people behind these policies and legal frameworks. And where is the gap between the person, their praxis, and the delivery of this policy and legal frameworks? So we're looking forward to this afternoon where we will have another power-packed conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chimwe. I feel like she's already outdone this panel. I'm not sure why we still need it. As Chimwe has introduced me, my name is Deus Valentine Reimagining from Tanzania. I run the Center for Strategic Litigation, which is, as the name suggests, a think and do tank on the rule of law and democracy, based in Tanzania but working across the region. I consider myself an honorary member of Akina Mama Africa. And inshallah, when I grow up, I hope I'll have the credentials to join as a full member. I'm a father of 2 daughters, which explains why Eunice thought I qualified to be part of this family. And I must say, Kina Mama holds a very special place in my heart. When Chimwe extended the invite, I don't remember when, I was hesitant because I had placed on myself a 13-year embargo from visiting Addis. My last tour here was not as pleasant as most of us would want when traveling to any city. So I decided I wouldn't come back. It took some convincing, and of course, you know, when it comes to Eunice, it's hard to say no. So I'm glad to be back here after those 13 years embargo. Mine is very simple. My role here is to make everybody speak. So I have every right to provoke you and to offend you. I believe you won't take it personal. But I don't think I'll have to go that far because we have a panel of very eminent speakers. I am the minority in my own household. I'm the only male in my household. So I'm used to this environment. And where I come from in Tanzania, women represent the ruling class. So I'm quite comfortable in this space for that matter. But I have 3 panelists with me. And I kind of have a conflict because I have a member of parliament from my own country, and I have a sister-in-law on this same panel. So I kind of have a conflict of interest. And I have a very, very, very good friend of mine also on this panel. So thank you for the excellent choice of panelists. Dr. Joe Asunka, who's on this panel, although he's not here with us physically, but he's there online and will join us in sharing some interesting insight on what the data tells us on the state of women, not only women participation, rather what the data tells us about the women on this continent and the kind of leadership they aspire. Now, to join me on this panel, allow me to invite, at the risk of sounding conflicted, my sister-in-law, Dikeledi, to this panel. I will not do the honor of introducing my panelists, but give them the space to do that themselves because I see them. And then also with us is Honorable Neema Lugangira from Tanzania, who also chairs the Africa Parliamentary Network on Internet Governance, and therefore has a thing or two to tell us about technology-facilitated gender-based violence. Also joining us on this panel is Joseph Asunka, the CEO of the Afrobarometer, all the way from Ghana. We're pleased to have you with us, Joe. So before we get into the gist of the matter, allow me to give 90 seconds to each of our panelists to introduce themselves so you know who you're talking to. And thereafter, we will get into exactly what Chimwemwe was trying to allude to, which is bridging the gap between the very theoretical aspects of this important question vis-a-vis what the practice is telling us. Because clearly there seems to be something lacking given the numbers we saw this morning. So we are trying to essentially untangle what that missing bit is. And hopefully this panel, and with all your participation, we'll be able to get to that and have some work for our colleagues at WPP to start work around. I will ask Dr. Dikeledi to go last. Her work will be to knit together the reactions that we get from the 2 practitioners. On one hand, Joseph will share what the data tells us about women's aspirations, and Honorable Neema Lugangira, who will tell us about her experience in the practice and what she's seeing as a practicing politician herself, and what the challenges there are. Dikeledi will take us through what that means from a theoretical perspective, a political economy perspective and what kind of institutional transformation or evolution we ought to focus on if we are serious about changing the numbers that we are told don't lie. So to start us off, I invite Honorable Lugangira to introduce herself, tell us a bit about her background and how she ended up here. And then after that, we'll invite Dikeledi and finish with Dr. Asunka.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nema Lugangira, Member of Parliament in Tanzania. I'm very happy to be here. Special thanks to Akina Mama. As Dale said, obviously you cannot say no to Eunice and Chimwemwe. But I'm very much passionate and committed in the area of women in politics. Basically, I have been pushing for policy advocacy for a good number of years. And in 2017, I decided to push policy from the political side. So I joined the political party, the ruling party CCM, and I worked on pushing policy change from within the party. And I can say that I succeeded because one of my main agendas was to get our party to prioritize nutrition. And if you look at the election manifesto of 2020-2025, nutrition has been prominently mentioned and prioritized in the election manifesto. So that goes to show the importance of sometimes when you're doing advocacy, sometimes you need to cross over and do it from the other side. And in 2020, it was a natural progression to get into politics. And here I am, a member of parliament, vied for the first time and won for the first time. And I can tell you, the work that you do along the way paves the way. Thank you.
Oh, wow, amazing. And I think also it shows the importance of really not relegating the political space to other people, right? So you, on this particular seat, you are also the right person to be leading our countries and leading us. And thank you for actually, taking over. So I'm a lecturer, right, by profession. So I work at the University of Johannesburg, and I'm married to a wonderful Tanzanian man, which basically... So we're trying to generate, a Pan-Africanist family, right? Advancing regional integration through love, So essentially that's what we're trying to do. So, yeah, in a sense, I'll just leave it at that. I'm a lecturer, and I've also been an activist, continue to do, academic activism. I've also been in political leadership in various spaces, but now as there are other things that I'm also trying to push, with the hope that more and more young women, get into political office as well. So I'll just leave it at that, and we leave our next speaker to introduce themselves. Asante.
Thank you very much. And I must honor my brother, who obviously has done a lot of the right things. To leave my sister-in-law this happy. Joseph, please.
Hi, yes, thanks so much, Deus, and thanks to Akinama Africa. It's just a great pleasure to be here. My name is Joseph Asonga. I'm the CEO of Afrobarometer, and truly honored to be sitting with these powerful women, and I can see where the conflict is coming there. So, but really glad to be here, and I have been a feminist gender champion for many years. Back in my days at the Hewlett Foundation, where I used to work as a funder, that was the main area for me, and I continue to work in this space. So I'm happy to be here. I don't know if I'm qualified to be, but I'm really happy to be here. But thank you all.
I'm sure time will be the best judge of your qualification, Joe. As they say, where I come from, save the best for last. And we were reminded consistently this morning of our common blind spot when it comes to women empowerment. And I'm sure when you look at the panel, you will see where that blind spot is. Can anyone guess? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to call to the front Ruth Bolo, and this has nothing to do with, I promise you, Ruth, it has nothing to do with the sibling rivalry between our two countries. It was rather the guide that I received initially that misled me into thinking would invite you later. Please have a seat right here, don't worry. My job is to stand here today, so I'm not going to be taking that seat. I want to stay active and awake. And if there any of you try to agree with me when they're disagreeing, we'll invite Mam Shibalala to train us again on staying awake, because clearly that's an area she's specialized in. Now, I would like to invite some honest reflections. And on this one, I want to invite Dr. Sunka. In July, we were in Accra, where Afrobarometer launched the Africa Insights report, which was a culmination of work that the Afrobarometer had done for some time. Basically, checking a pulse of what Africans felt on a wide range of governance questions. And obviously, as with any such survey, there was particular insight there from the women on the continent and their yearning for democratic governance, which, you know, it's easy to generalize and say, you know, it's women. They're Africans. They're Africans first before they're women, right? And therefore, whatever Africans say they desire to see in their leadership is what women desire to see in their leadership. But I want to challenge Joe to think hard about his reflections in light of that report and any other reports that Afrobarometer has been involved in. What do the women on this continent really desire in terms of democratic governance?
All right, thank you so much. And to start with, Afrobarometer is a Pan-African survey research program. We have been doing this work for the past 25 years. And I think on the issue of women, not just women alone, but generally, what do Africans think about women in leadership? And we have been asking Africans across about 40 countries about what the leadership role of women and their views about how women should or should not play leadership role, but also thinking about political leadership and whether or not men make better political leaders than women. And over time, what we've seen, 20 years ago, it used to be the case that we had more people saying that men make better leaders. But over time, what we've seen, that has shifted very significantly over the past 10 years, where increasingly people are becoming more and more supportive of the fact that men do not make better political leaders than women, and that they want more women to be in leadership roles. And I think that is driven by what people generally see as what they want to see in their leaders, the critical component being openness and transparency, as well as accountability. And I think these are qualities of leadership that have been lacking on the African continent from the perspective of citizens over time, that they do not see many of their leaders being accountable. And as I mentioned, 10 years ago, when we asked people whether you want a government that can get things done, even if it cannot deliver, or you want a government that is accountable to you, even if it is not able to deliver effectively. And over time, the positions have shifted where people are increasingly more interested in leaders that will be accountable to them than leaders who just get things done. And I think this is one of the main drivers of why people are increasingly very supportive. And now we have a big majority of Africans saying that women should be in leadership roles, especially in public office. And I think it's this sense of wanting leaders who are accountable and transparent about the way they manage government business, especially in the public sector, is one critical piece that is driving this growing interest in having women in leadership positions. And I think, of course, the conversation earlier this morning that they paint that picture. The gaps we continue to see, and as the Africa Barometer on women's leadership has shown, we continue to see those gaps in our data as well, whether it is in the area of asset ownership, decision-making, both at the household level and at the national level. We consistently continue to see women lagging behind men. But I think the good news is that more and more majority of African citizens, especially younger people, are very supportive of women in leadership positions. And I think the work that Mama of Africa does, together with other activists in this space, would actually be aligned with citizen views and what Africans do want to see in their leaders. That people who have the commitment to be transparent in their operations, but also accountable to citizens for the confidence they repose in them. So I'll hold it here and then happy to contribute more.
Thank you so much, Joe. And I want to just pick up on your last point about this increasing support for women leadership, and hopefully at some point in the discussion we'll also remind ourselves that authoritarian leadership has little to do with gender, and we must be frank about it so that we do not romanticize this question. But getting into the practice, my sister Ruth, we were trying to save the best for last, but we'll start with you now. Just building on the views that Joe has expressed. In Kenya, the rulers had accused young people of being digital wankers. And nobody really knows what young people in Kenya want. At least that's what they're being accused of. I don't know if that's true, that people don't know what they want, although I saw a whole 17-point manifesto that they produced. But in that yearning for better governance, what do young women particularly want as their benchmark for the kind of transparent and accountable leadership that Joe has described?
Thank you. Mr. Moderator, allow me to break protocol a little bit and request that we observe a minute of silence for Gala's mom and all the other women who have died while our countries are going through horrible, horrible governance issues. Just a minute.
We might as well stand in honor of these people.
Thank you. So to your question, allow me to start by explaining a little bit of my background. When I got into the political space, I had just turned 18, and everyone in my society thought that that was too young for you to get into the political space. And I ended up joining a lobby group that was an all-men's lobby group dubbed Sons of Raila. At the time, there was an all-women's lobby group called Daughters of Raila. And everyone would wonder, what is wrong with that young girl who is joining an all-male group? And I got to see firsthand the difficulties that young women particularly go through while trying to get into the political space. Shortly after that, I joined a political party, and I realized that when you go to the youth wing, they're telling you, there's space for you at the women wing. Why don't you go and play a role there? And when you go to the women wing, they tell you, but you're still young. Why don't you go and look for space at the Youth Congress? And so that lived experience is what has pushed me to work in strengthening, one, young women who are already in leadership roles, and two, young women who have played active politics in university and are finding it difficult to cross over to the national politics. So I work quite a lot with, one, women who are in leadership spaces, and two, young women who want to get into leadership spaces. Now, the digital wankers, as they were called, made history in 2024 when they got into parliament. But it was not just about getting into parliament. It was about using their voices in a way that the president got to hear them and at least yield into one of the demands. And they were able to use different tactics. So whenever we hear about getting into politics, a lot of times we imagine someone standing and, talking on the microphone and all that. But what young people said is, I can be involved in the political conversation by tapping into my different talents. So for those who are musicians, they went out and they did songs such as Anguka Nayo, the one we have just danced to. There are those who also did a reggae song, which was very popular, and it would go like, President Ruto, don't you see? And it was very popular
popular. And so they were able to say that just like in a party where every person has a different role, not everyone will be cutting salad. There are those whose work is to play music. There are those whose work is to usher you in. Similarly, in the political space, there's a role for everybody. And young people are saying that we, regardless of whoever is on the seat, we want to strengthen the governance structures. So that if today Ruth Bolo is on the seat, then she knows these are the laws that I need to follow. If tomorrow we have Honorable Shabalala there, then the structures are the same. So regardless of whoever is on that seat, we want to ensure that we are pushing for structures that can stand the test of time. Democratic structures that may not necessarily be perfect, but at least are people-centric. Another thing that was there was the issue of action and not rhetoric, because a lot of times, especially in the campaign process, there's a lot of rhetoric. Those, during the campaign period, it's very heated. You love to hear sweet words. You love to hear, the different proverbs that go around. But now campaign season is over. It's time for action. We want to see the promises that you made in your manifestos working for us. We want to see the issue of transparency and accountability. And you cannot say that you have published. So in Kenya, we've got the Public Participation Forum, which is basically a platform for dialogue and getting feedback from citizens. But the challenge with that is that the Constitution does not provide for what qualifies to be a successful public participation forum. So I will gather 5 of my relatives and say, hey, I did a public participation forum. And those are the things that young people are saying. These are the platforms that we would want you to talk to us through. And we want that the feedback we give is actually taken into the account. Another issue was that we were asking the different leaders that are there to leverage on technology and social media. Over time, social media has been seen as a platform for fun. But we are telling you that I do not have to come to your doorstep early in the morning to tell you that we are having an issue in my school. I do not have to blast you on social media to tell you that there is a hospital that does not even have water. So if I am sent to take my urine sample, I cannot get into that washroom because it doesn't have water, it doesn't have electricity, and those issues. So we are saying, you are able to use these platforms for accountability. Talk to us and tell us, these are the funds that you have been allocated to, and this is how you have used it. Don't just come to us when you don't have funds and you're saying the counties have not received funds. In Uganda, we have 3 revolutionary, very young women who were recently arrested because they, in the protests, they painted their breasts the flag of Uganda. And they were saying that you're not listening to us. So maybe if we did it this way, then you'll be able to hear us out. So we're just saying that we need to be listened to. We want leaders who are actually listeners. We want leaders who are listening to feedback and they're actively listening, not just listening for the sake. And finally, we are saying that we've seen women, the older women specifically, get in through leadership spaces through blood, sweat, and tears. Those stories are horrific. And so when we sit down and we are told that I lost my bodyguard when campaigning, my house was burnt down, and those are the stories we hear after they've gotten into politics, then we shy away. But we need to be told, despite all that sacrifices, we would like you to get on board, because if I am the only woman in the finance committee, then I cannot push for a gender mainstreamed budget. I cannot push for certain taxes to be removed. So you need to join me in this space. You need to join me in the campaign platform, because anyway, you are the ones who are mobilizing for all these other politicians. So why not mobilize for yourselves?
Thank you very much. And before we move on, just to take you back a bit, you said there's a role for everyone. Now, I would like to hear some reflection on what the role of young women in the recent protests in Kenya was, and what lessons the rest of us can pick from it before we move on to Honorable Lugangira.
So in the recent Kenyan protests, the first thing that we really saw young women particularly doing is mobilizing. And mobilizing in 2 ways. There was resource mobilization and there was human resource mobilization. And then there was the organizing for those particular protests. So if you looked at a lot of the resource mobilization that was being carried out across the different platforms, they were being championed by women. It is young women who were saying, we need to channel funds to this direction, and they are going to, 1, help the victims who have been either arrested or who have been injured in the protests. two, we are going to use these funds to also give support to those who have lost their lives and their families need to give them a decent send-off. We're going to use this to also, sometimes it was not just monetary, but they would go out and look for people who can give bottles of water to people who are protesting. So there was the issue of resource mobilization. The second way they were doing is by organizing, where they would say, this is the point where we are all going to congregate before we start. In case you need to, in case you're injured, this is the point that you need to go to. For those who need blood donation, we have set up a blood donation camp. So they were very much at the forefront of, organizing the crucial points that people needed to know of in case of anything. There was also the issue of technology. There was a very famous technology app. I know we all know of Zello, but there was one called Life 360, where I would know, so this is her battery life, and this is where she is at. So if she is in the protest and her battery is almost going down, then I need to connect her to someone whose battery life is okay, just in case she needs to, get home in the evening, in case she'll need some money, in case her loved ones need to be able to find her on phone. So we saw a lot of young people, young women particularly, push for that particular app. And for those who are not able to go to the protest for one reason or the other, they had a support group where their work was to find out, is there anybody missing? Is there anyone who has been jailed? Because if I'm in the protest, I might not be able to answer my call because my phone, in the running battles with the security forces. But there's a support group of people who are not able to come to the protest, but they are able to answer your call and give you direction. We, of course, also saw them really go into the protests, and we saw a lot of young women in the legal space also give advice. If you watched a lot of the clips on TikToks, they were able to break down, especially when they were told they don't know why they are protesting. They said, no, we know this is the process of passing the finance bill. We know this is where we are at, and these are the exact reasons why we are asking you to reject the bill.
Thank you very much, and we'll come back to you during the second round of question because you've alluded to the reality, the tough reality of violence in our politics, and I guess it applies to many parts of our continent, of course with varied levels of magnitude, as we have heard from Cameroon and Sudan. So, Honorable Gangira, he might not be Africa's favorite son, but Julius Malema said, it's rough, hey? Politics is rough. There's a way you presented yourself earlier and made it sound so simple that you were on this side and then you went into that other side. But I, being Tanzanian myself, know it has not been easy for you, and would like you to share some candid reflections of engaging in politics at that level, the national, the local, the regional, and the global as well, because we know you're involved in all these different layers. And to just give us hints, maybe 3 to 5 hints of what does it take to survive in that rough environment.
Thank you very much. I, however, would like to kind of disagree a little bit with the assumption that you made, because indeed what I actually said is actually the truth. And I think that also speaks to the way in which countries perhaps differ on the political landscape. I was working in a public-private partnership organization prior to being a member of parliament, or prior to getting into politics. But perhaps maybe throughout my career, I was involved in policy advocacy, and the way in which I carried myself throughout that process enabled me to build relations and build that authenticity of myself. And when I got into politics, into the political party, I did not change. And this is a crucial issue. I didn't change. I remained true to the same NEMA before I got into the political parties. And that is why I even said I got into CCM, and my first biggest agenda was to push for nutrition in a political party, which is something perhaps most would not do. So that is the route that I chose. And when I vied into getting into politics, in Tanzania, we have the special quarter. So in our political party in CCM, the women's wing are responsible for the election. So we vie and do our election within the women's wing, which means you're voted for by women. And the challenges that were there were to be expected because I was new into the space. Perhaps my political background is not the same as others. But again, I chose to be authentic. I chose to just be myself. I didn't pretend to know what I don't know. And I stuck to the development issues that, if given a chance, I would go for. And prior to running for parliament, I first ran for political position within the women's wing. So maybe that could be a learning point on how to get into politics. Others get in straight into and to run for parliament position. Others go through the political party rule. And once you're in the political party, you would learn and know how to navigate and even build confidence. But interestingly, once you're in parliament, that's where I experienced a big shift. So I just wanted to clarify that part, in the sense that could be the differences in countries, it could be the differences in individuals, how you go about the politics, but that was my personal experience. But the experience once you're in politics, now that's where everything tilts. It tilts from the way the civil society will view you, tilts from the way the public will deal with you, or the assumptions they will make over you. And then it tilts even with your own colleagues, even from your own political party who are male. For example, we have general elections next year, so some of us are in special seats. Obviously, if you want to increase the number of women in parliament, you have to go to constituency. So there you face other issues. So I think the scenario changes depending on at what stage you're at. So I'll dive a little bit into some of the questions, and maybe it will shed some light on those challenges. But this does not mean that everybody's route is like that as my own. Routes are different. And in overall, yes, it is challenging. And in overall, I think for a woman to succeed, you need to have done either 10 times more harder work. And once you're even in the position, you need to work 10 times harder than your counterparts. That's the reality. Now, in terms of the key things I'd like to highlight, is the first one I'd like to talk about quotas. I know one of the speakers prior said quotas are not maybe are not necessary. Let me tell you, quotas are necessary. Because to expect a woman who's never been in politics to get into politics and to be able to navigate that space is impossible. And quotas pave way for women to get into politics. And then they are supposed to graduate to another area, to the other stage of that political landscape. We have examples, even within Africa, countries that had quotas that were mandatory. The number of women representation, for example, in parliament went high. And when the quotas became voluntary, the number dropped. So quotas are critical. So I just wanted to emphasize the issue of quotas. I think are important, very, very critical. But number two, political parties. Everything we talk about, if it is not instilled in political parties, it's not going to work, because at the end of the day, decisions are made by political parties. That is why it is important for women to also get into political parties. Nothing will happen without the political parties. So in 2021, and I'm trying to summarize here, in 2021, I proposed in Parliament that we need to have amendments on our political and election legislations. And this is something which was aligned by our President, Her Excellency President Dr. Samia Suluhu Hassan. And what we did in the amending our political party, the act of our political party, right now, the Political Party Act requires all political parties to have gender desks. A crucial revolutionary milestone, because there's a lot of abuse that happens within political parties and you don't know where to report, because this is someone from your own party. How do you deal with that? But also, political parties have to have gender and social inclusion policies, and have to have programs that outline how are they going to increase the representation of youth, women, and people with disability. But these things need to be enshrined in the law. If they're not, it will be a challenge. So I cannot emphasize enough the issue of involvement of political parties. Third one, very quickly, is legislative, the legislative framework. How is the legislative framework? One of the biggest hurdles of women getting into politics is gender-based violence. But it's a big hurdle even for us women who are into politics, shifting or graduating from being special seat MP or special seat local government official to constituency or ward that is being elected by the public. But what is the Election Act saying about gender-based violence? Gender-based violence is usually in the criminal acts, criminal offenses and acts, and it's handled in that way. But during election, and when a woman experiences a GBV-related matter during election, if you go through the criminal route, by the time the case is even being listened to, the election is done and someone has already been announced a winner. So there has to be an alternative way. So the only alternative way is to ensure that GBV is recognized in election acts. So right now, I am proud to say that through our efforts, Tanzania is the only country in Africa that has recognized gender-based violence in election as an electoral offense. To sum up, visibility of women in politics. The public is not going to vote for us if they don't know about our work, if they don't see about our work, if the impact that we're creating is not being amplified. My call on organizations such as yours, you need to find ways to deliberately support women and increase their visibility deliberately, because short of doing that, we're going to be running around in circles. But at the end of the day, when the time for going out there to run, women are going to run, they're not going to be voted for. Not because they don't have the potential, but people don't know them. So how are we going to get people to be known? We need to increase the visibility of women. Finally, oftentimes when we're near to election, you will find lots of funding available, lots of organizations suddenly running around, trying to support aspiring women to run. But usually, I'm sorry to say, it is done very late. Very, very late. Many of our countries now either are in elections now or are going to elections next year. But where are these programs? These programs are going to start coming a month before the election, and you expect to find women, get them ready, make them be able to vie and win. It's not possible. So if we truly want to increase the representation of women in politics, we have to change the way we're doing things. We have to truly have our programs early on, a year or even before that, plan it well. But at the end of the day, we must have funding available to support these women. And by supporting these women, I don't mean giving them handouts. But you can support a woman, maybe a woman is in Nairobi, you can support her to have a focus group discussion, bring experts for her to speak to her people. You can support a woman in many ways. But most of the funding that is available is to sit in rooms to discuss how to make the environment easy for women, how women should vie. Women need to get out there, women need to have thick skin, but when it gets down to it on the ground, there is nothing. And that's where I'll end for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very challenging. It sounds like a whole program of its own, but it speaks to the depth of your engagement in this space. So thank you very much. Now, my sister-in-law, you've listened to all this talk, which we claim it to be very practical, but there's always a role for theory. Because I don't believe in activists who are not intellectually grounded. I don't think they're much better than the populists we detest. So I think this intellectual grounding is key. And patriarchy is an institution. There's a political economy of it, right? When you hear these complaints about young women having to join a young men's group in order for them to be visible, and you hear about the strategies that our sister Nema is alluding to, they're institutional factors. What in some spaces we call the master's tools. Are we going to use the master's tools to dismantle this patriarchy? What kind of institutional reforms must we be thinking of? And what sort of incentives must we place on those institutions in order for them to start recalibrating into a safe environment that addresses many of these concerns that have been raised? So let's hear from you, and then we'll take one last round of questions before we invite the audience.
All right, thank you very much. I think the answer to your question was covered this morning, to be honest with you, by Mechabalan. Basically, we have governance systems that are clearly not Afrocentric. We have political economy that really, so some, for instance, if you just go back to some of the issues that were raised this morning around, quality of leadership, some of the challenges, and the thing that came to my head was, but then if we engage what substantive leadership that we expect from women, if we want to engage issues around what quality is, then we need to really go back and ask, what do you refer to when it comes to quality, right? What then is the quality of leadership? And if we want young women, or women in that matter, to participate in governance, but then what are they participating in, right? So now it goes back to that. It goes back to some of the suggestions that were made this morning by Mechabalan. And I'm just going to highlight, for instance, Thank you so much. So we, unfortunately, as women, as Africa, we are embroiled, forced, a part of a global system that is designed in a way that will perpetually create all the problems that we have been highlighting in this room, the problems that we are seeing in our countries, and those problems will not go away. They will never go away. Even if you may have 100% of women leading political spaces, but the system itself, the global system that we live in and exist in, is not designed in a way that actually goes back to what you were saying, a people-centered system that is supposed to literally be supporting people, right? And then of course, then whenever we think about, again, just to go back to this idea on an analytical level, because everybody actually has been speaking theory as well, right? And activism, by the way, is always intellectual and theoretical, right? So the work that you highlighted in terms of what young women were doing, right? Besides the political, leadership work that they've been doing, that also speak to some of the social reproductive work they've been doing, providing health services in the context of protest. That's a social reproductive issue, right? And in a sense, you also mentioned earlier, just to tie back the conversation here. So you spoke about, the importance of funding, funding women in political leadership. The women here in Kenya provided us with that particular model around how then we fund, because these are young women who also were raising funds, right? So, and now when we go back to, again, bringing in, that conversation around Afrocentricity that Mechabalala brought us back to, then when you think about issues around funding, when you think about issues around development finance, and then really if you wanted to do things the Afrocentric way and go back to what our African ancestors actually used to operate, and even in contemporary times, we see forms of development finance and financing that are practiced in many African villages. I'll give you an example, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this. In South Africa, we have Stokvel. In West Africa, they call this Osusu, and Osusu is basically, people coming together, putting exactly, sharing money, and then, perhaps maybe, for instance, if I want to build a house, 10 or 11 of you will be contributing, let's say maybe $100, and then when that money comes to me, I'm able to build whatever, perhaps buy cement or whatever, right? And then the next month or the next year, it's the other person. So all those models, when we study, those types of models of development finance have built schools, have built clinics in so many African countries, right? In so many African villages. So it goes back again, Afrocentricity. How did we do things? Do we do things in the way that our ancestors used to do? Do we go back to that knowledge? Or do we go the route of the IMF, and then we are seeing, irrespective of the consequences of that particular approach has been, on our lives, on our daily lives, on, the consequences that have led to why young people are protesting, the consequences of why many of us are miserable today because we can't even afford livelihood, right? So we know of all these consequences, and it goes back to us reproducing what this thing in the academy. I'm sure some of you have heard about decolonization and decoloniality, right? So say we call it the modern colonial capitalist system. So the modern colonial capitalist system, apologies. So, thank you so much. Sorry, I caught something when I came. The experience that was mentioned earlier about the airport and visas. I actually slept at the airport, very cold. Yeah, anyway, it's fine. So well, it's not fine. It is not fine. And maybe just should digress a bit. What made me think about, because what I noticed there, I was like, okay, so all of these people who are forced to not actually pass through are women in civil society spaces. Like in my observation, all the women who were stuck at the airport were women in civil society. And at that particular moment, you had an official with an official passport, yeah? Also did not have the papers that, were required of us, but that man was allowed to pass. So now it goes back to this idea about regional integration and the inclusion of women in regionalization of the continent. So, right? So you're seeing the modus operandi, like basically they're centered around regional integration that basically is on the level of the state, and actually one that what excludes ordinary passport holders. And I was like, it's so interesting. I mean, the majority of women who are participating in regionalization is through civil society space, right? And what is happening here is literally the visa immigration officers are hampering regionalization. And unfortunately, that process of regionalization is affecting women. So I just wanted to thank you for allowing me to rant a minute about my experience. But it's not just an experience of sleeping at the airport. It's really about a much more bigger thing around regional integration. Regional integration is largely around between states, right? But then regionalization, this is where all of us then come in as well, of building regions, building unity within the continent. And if we are treated in that particular way, where laws, or perhaps some people say it's not a law, I don't know, but if people who are operating in the civil society space are treated in that way, then it's a problem. And unfortunately, then those people are gendered and, so female gendered. Anyway, just to go back to that, the other point, right? So all of these things, right? So it goes back to the modern colonial capitalist system, which is designed, one, in decoloniality. So I'll break it down. So you have this thing called decolonial political economy. And in decolonial political economy, you are expected to do an analysis, so an analytical framework, right? But not just an analytical framework, but it's also a tool that is inspiring you and everybody to go back and look at how are things done alternatively, right? How did for instance, how were indigenous mode of political economy, how were, indigenous mode of political organization, indigenous mode of economic organization, all of those things, right? So essentially the decolonial aspect is you're highlighting what the problem is while drawing from the knowledge that actually exists and the knowledge that is in the margins, because there are other forms of political economy that exist that have carried societies, right? So what colonization has done, of course, so colonization, and particularly when you think about it, it's so clever in a sense that it presents itself as this thing that is big and indestructible, whereas it's actually all of it throughout the world. It operates in specific centers. But when you move outside of the centers, that's where you see indigenous ways of living. That's where they're basically spaces of learning, right? And now this goes back to all of us to say, If you are then going into those spaces of learning, don't go though into those spaces with your colonial missionary mindset that I am going there to save those people. We must go there to learn from those who are in the margins in order to come and fix what clearly is not working in the center. Because what is happening in the center is so problematic that it requires violence to sustain itself. It requires so many forms of exclusions, right? Marginalizations, inequality is endemic, is literally a part of the modern colonial system. There's no way that you will get rid of inequality, poverty, and a number of all these other challenges that, you know, I'm sure many of you are working on, right, to try and alleviate. Those things will not go away because the system is structured to reproduce those things. They are dependent on those things, right? I'll give you an example. So when whatever politicians, whether male or female, when they left their house and went to parliament, they depended on somebody at home to clean, right? Wash their clothes. And that's a social reproductive labor that nobody's actually acknowledging. When we think about GDP growth and all of these things, nobody's measuring the social reproductive work. That's right. And the productive space is dependent heavily on that social reproductive work. So in a sense, so now when we go back to the idea of feminist political economy, which is what you highlighted earlier, right? There are different forms of feminisms, right? So the main one that seems to be dominant, is the sense of a liberal feminist approach, right? And then you see it also with these conversations around democracy, around mainstreaming gender itself, a sort of mainstreaming gender and thinking about feminism in a liberal perspective, which essentially is about centralizing the human being, centralizing the women. You want women to be equal to men, but not necessarily changing the system that actually is producing inequality, right? So that would be the feminist aspect. So you want to create women, we want to empower women so that they are part of the economy and all of that, without also being acknowledged or acknowledging the darker side, by the way, of that inclusion, right? So in decoloniality, we speak about the darker side of the modern colonial system. And the darker side is all the other things that we not speak about, that we not see, right? When we come into this very beautiful city, by the way, very, very clean city, with beautiful buildings, very tall buildings, yeah? We're seeing development. But the darker side of that development is the displacement of families from their homes demolished. And now today, those families have to find, one, where do you live? How then also do you afford whatever form of livelihood now that because you've been, displaced? So all of these things, so those are the darker side, right? So in a sense, decoloniality forces us to look at that. So wanting to include women, to empower them without really dealing with the systematic issue, that will be a problem. Then the other aspect, which I'll not really, because I think Maichabala highlighted, is the epistemic one, right? The epistemic element. So going back to our values, going back to how our ways of knowing, our systems of modalities around governance, etc., that we have to actually learn from and bring them into the center. Because what we are operating in right now, our version of political economy is very Western-centric. It is not built for Africans. It is not built for African communities. It is not built for African families. I'll give you an example. The economic unit that we use today, right, that we measure, right, it's basically the household, right, in macroeconomics. It's the household. And that the concept of that particular household is based on a Western-centric family structure of a man, woman, children. And of course, in man, women, children, the man is the head, right? The other ones are, Litchfield, mentioned, and Mechabalala mentioned earlier. But we know our African households, the structures of our own families are not premised on a nuclear family system. We are a network of people, and I'm using network of people because of the language of English is not allowing me to use, right, to represent what I'm saying, right? So this idea of a collective of people living together, that's basically what is a family. So now if your unit of analysis really looks at a smaller Nyana household and not all these other Asians that are part of it, then that also becomes problematic, right? So in a sense, we're dealing with a political economy system or analysis that is not really Afrocentric or premised on our own realities. So there are those types of feminists who don't have a problem with that, and of course there are other feminists who would say, no. There's all of this is problematic, and then of course then other feminist political economists who would say, let's bend down patriarchy. Let's bend down capitalism because it is the source of all our problems, right? And at the same time, they would say, no, just because we're bending down capitalism does not necessarily mean that we want communism, because communism is not devoid of the same epistemic issues of modernity, right? And epistemic issue of modernity whereby, in some instances, patriarchy actually prevailed. We've seen communist countries, right? Especially if you're analyzing them from a gender perspective. If you then bring in the Afrocentric sort of approach to that, right? Afrocentric feminist approach to political economy. The idea is, so then how then do we organize ourselves on the basis of one, our own sort of history, right? Our own Africanness, in a sense. And just to give you a simple example, it would be around this idea of communalism. And everybody, you speak about Ubuntu, but Ubuntu says if it's something that is over there. But Ubuntu can also be, as much as a philosophical as it can also be an economic sort of theory. And our own African cultures and languages, that's why it goes back again to what Ms. Chabalala mentioned in this morning, the importance of language. When you eradicate language, there's so much that you lose. I'll give you an example. In my language, in Sesotho, there's a proverb that says, Bana ba motho ba kgaolela na hloho ya tsiye. That is a tax justice approach, right? Feminists today are talking about tax justice, so I'm going to translate. So bana ba motho ba kgaolela na hloho ya tsiye. Bana ba motho is like siblings, right? Tsiye is a locust. So in a sense, the transliteration is siblings share a locust head. So it doesn't matter how much or how little that you have. The idea is around redistributing the resources in a way that everybody will get something. That is what tax justice is. And again, we go back to our own indigenous knowledges, because that is a proverb. That is an entire economic sort of theory, in a sense, if you were to put it at that, right? So it goes back. So again, even if we may have all these other things of wanting women to be in parliament, women in the AU, whatever, but as long as the system itself does not change, if in that sense it goes back to the idea of institutions, right? And I think the beautiful part, as Chimwe mentioned earlier and reminded us, that institutions are made up of people. Institutions are made up of people. So now the work is around changing the consciousness of Africans in order for the Africans themselves to effect the changes that we want to see in the so-called institutions that are leading our lives, right? And of course, in that context, be mindful of other external global forces that want Africa to remain where it is. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Yes, I was struggling to stop my sister-in-law lest that would provoke a family meeting. I've tried very hard. So thank you. I mean, if anyone had any doubts of your profession as a lecturer, I think many of those doubts have now been cast. These are mind-boggling questions. I don't know. I think we need to extend the Sawubona to maybe another, at least 3.5 weeks. To fully exhaust these, I mean, mind-boggling. At some point you noticed I stopped writing because I was getting confused myself with this Afrocentric systems that you talk about, and decolonization and reproduction of the capitalist model and the colonial political economy. And you mentioned institutions towards the end. And when I was sitting at the table, I will protect the person who mentioned this to me. I was challenged to think of two things. One, we talk a lot about patriarchy and the fact that I represent the leading culprits of reproducing that patriarchy. But the question that was asked at my table was, who gave birth to us, the culprits? And what role are they playing in enabling that patriarchy? I think it's important to reflect on that as well before we end up down the track of simply victimizing, the current generation. Yes, you're fighting us and you have every right. I unfortunately married a feminist myself, so I experience this on a daily basis, which is why I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable with all sorts of debates. But I think that's an important question, right? Because maybe if the person who gave birth to me did not do some of the things she did in the household when I was 8 years old and being forced to cook with my sisters and wash clothes with them, maybe I wouldn't even understood the person I ended up with, right? So I think sometimes I feel in several of these debates, and unfortunately so when I sit with young women and I see them throw all the stones, and I wonder if they have sons, what is it exactly they're going to train their sons on? Because they could pass on some of this trauma, and at the end of the day, they produce men who can't change the system. So that is one that I'm throwing it out there. I'm not seeking answers per se, and therefore it draws to your last point on institutions and how we think about transforming. You talked about families and the need for us to look at that notion itself with some level of expansive view and liberty. And I think, we sit here, you look at that presentation that Josephine made earlier, we're looking at political parties, we're looking at parliaments, we're looking at cabinet. I don't know if anyone has done a survey on the most important institution and what role that institution is playing in transforming that dynamic, because I think it's rather ignorantly superstitious to expect that the dynamics that one brings home from will change when they enter a space where that relationship or that dynamic is being replicated. So that was I felt challenged by my sister-in-law, so I thought I should try and act smart myself. Now, let me take this back. One round of questions again before we invite the audience, because I see the audience is very excited with this subject, and we're going to give the opportunity for everyone in the room to ask a question. This is what I signed up for. I'm sorry, Chimwe and Eunice, if that is not what you were expecting. Now, I'll first go back to Ruth. And when you stopped speaking, I said, I'll come back to you, because I find it intriguing. Dikeledi has made reference to the role that women played, the service provision role. And I wonder, when you look at that role that young women played, some of whom I've happened to get to know as a result of their work during the protests, and compare it to the 80s when Wangari and the others were playing their own role, what difference do you see? What is the role of this current generation of young women activists, and how is it different from those who came before them?
Okay, allow me to first react to some of the conversations. Nema spoke about visibility, and I'd like to just touch a little bit on that, because media is a key player when it comes to visibility. And I'd like to give two instances. The first instance I'll give is where we had an interview back in Kenya, where one of our women representatives was having an interview with a gentleman, and the gentleman became so hostile, but insulting her, and was almost getting physical. But the journalists who were present, the best that they were doing is, no, let's not go that direction. Let's not go that direction. Let's calm down. But the violence in which was being perpetuated, I expected them to take him off the stage in that same manner and protect the lady. Because I am sure if it was a gentleman who was doing the same, who was being attacked, because they know the repercussions that have come with it, then they would very quickly say, call in security, we need to cut the feed, But when it comes to the ladies, it is because you're in politics, and in Swahili we say siasa sio kanisa, politics is not the church. So you need to accept all these ills that are coming in. So we need to train the media personalities or the journalists on responsive gender reporting, and ensuring that those media spaces are very safe. And to my fellow women, a lot of times we get journalists who will call you and ask, I'm looking for a female panelist. And you give them a name and they say, that one has said the show is too early. The other one has said she's not made her hair. So are we able to say that whatever happens, I will go there with my matutas? I don't know if there's an English word for it, but I will go there with my short braids and I will make sure that whatever my output is will be so strong, but nobody will care what I'm wearing. Because we don't have the men asking themselves, I don't have a tie that matches the color of my shirt. So when it comes to visibility, I thought of reacting to that. And there was the issue of financing, which you mentioned, and I'd like us to just ask ourselves in the room, do we want to win or do we want to be right as women? Eventually we want both, but where we are at now, do we want to win in the push that we are getting, or do we want to be right? And why I ask this is tied to the question of the financing, and goes to every other items that we try to push, that sometimes we want to be right so bad that we end up losing some of the gains that we are being offered. When it comes to financing, there's campaign financing, there's protest financing, and they're very different. They're different forms of financing. And Neema spoke about campaign financing when she was talking about how late it comes. And sometimes you find the women parliamentarians or the women legislators, they'll tell you that when I'm supposed to be looking for money for agents, I am being given t-shirts. But when I needed those t-shirts, they were not there. So a conversation that we maybe need to have is, can we as civil society, because I know we also have reporting mechanisms where you have to put what the exact outcome was, are we able to say this is the framework we are going to use when it comes to supporting women candidates? And when it comes to protest financing, because you had talked about women resource mobilizing, a lot of times when we're doing protest financing, so I'll give my instance, not in this recent protest. So when I was at Sons of Raila, we were in charge of doing IEBC demos in 2017, where we were basically demonstrating against the Electoral Commission and saying that we needed certain changes. But what I saw during that period of time is that a lot of those who were supporting us were male legislators. And they would tell you, I need you to do this in my constituency. So you'd find that a lot of the funding we were getting would be directed to that particular constituency, because they understood that if I come from the opposition political party and my people are seeing that in my constituency there are protests going on, then it gives me a boost of some sort. Now those are the realities that we also need to tell women leaders, so that then it's not an issue of, because we've established political parties are very important. It's not an issue of the political party saying, but we are not feeling your strength, both as a political party and also in the ground. When we come to what the women activists are doing, I think, one, there is an intergenerational disconnect. And you can see that even in the protest. When we were doing the femicide protest earlier on in the year, one of the things that came out so strong is we kept on asking, where are the women leaders? We are not seeing them, we're not hearing them. And when the women leaders finally came, one of them was really booed. And they kept on asking, you people were saying we are not seeing women leaders, and then we come and you're very hostile to us. So how do you expect us to put forward, or who do you expect to represent you in the National Assembly if you're not giving us the room? Now that clearly means that she has not understood why they are saying you should not be here. So there's a generational disconnect, one in terms of communication, two in terms of expectation, and in terms of how things are being done. The generation that is there now, and I want you to just think of the the relatives you have, and even the friends you have who are of the Gen Z and the Alpha and probably the late millennials. It's a generation that likes to negotiate. It's not a generation that you will come and tell you, this is how activism is done, and this is what we want to see at the end of your activism. No, it is a generation where you tell, okay, so we hear you and we have seen what you have presented, but this is what we are able to offer now. Is it possible? And they will tell you, we are seeing what you're able to offer, but for what you're giving us and for this cost, we think it can be changed in this direction, because we have the expertise as well, where we are able to tell you if it is a financial implication. In fact, what you're offering us will be be of a greater financial implication to you than what we are requesting for. So it's a generation that wants to negotiate and wants to be able to also give you their feedback too. I also talked about the creative side of it. And there's the approach of one size fits all, which doesn't necessarily work. Right now, we are saying if you go to the entertainment joints, we are taking activism there, where we will say that at midnight, we are all going to play the same song and we are all going to chant the same way. And some of those entertainment joints are owned by the people who need to hear what we are saying. So while they are asking what happened last night, how are the sales, they'll be told, by the way, the people came in, the sales were so low because everyone bought just a bottle throughout the night, and this is the message that they were chanting to you particularly at midnight because they know you own this place. We are saying that activism is on social media, where we are opening up an X space that we have not mobilized for, and we are giving conversations that matter to us, conversations that affect us on our daily lives. And I'll give an example of maybe, let me use the roads. A lot of our leaders use those roads when they are going to work. They use those roads when they are going to hospital. They use those roads when they are going to the airport or wherever they need to go. But they turn a blind eye and say, for as long as I'm able to get to where I'm going. So what we are saying is we are not going to come to your doorstep and put a placard because we know you have seen the road. What we are going to do is, in that place where you go to fix your car, that is where we are going to put graffiti on the wall. In that area where you're going to, seek services, we are going to give you pamphlets there. That area where you have decided to turn your blind eye on, we are going to use the medium that you cannot escape from. So I think it is just the fact that we are redefining activism in a way that works for us as individuals, and not necessarily how we have been taught by every other person. We are going into the chamas, Osusus, and where we are telling the women there, you are able to bring yourselves together for the betterment of your houses and your personal selves, because they put the money together to either buy items. Why can't we do that to feminize the political spaces? When was the last time, so in Kenya, the legal age for voting is 18. And so is it in many other countries. And so our next election is in 2027, which is about 3 years from now, yeah? Which means a 16-year-old now will be able to vote at that time. But when was the last time you talked to a 16-year-old and asked them, what do you think about the country? And because what all they hear right now is, even if you vote, it doesn't count because the Electoral Commission cannot be trusted. So if I am a 16-year-old, when I turn 18, I'm not going to go to take my voter's card because I've always been told that my vote does not count. And so the ripple effect or the long-term effect is that, one, we are going to get to a place where we are going to have a huge gap of leaders, because by natural causes or whatnot, the leaders that are there now eventually will need to exit the space. And we are not grooming, we are not allowing those who are coming up or to understand the importance and the patriotism and the Pan-African values. We're not integrating these things into them. We are only allowing them to get the other side of it. And they even if they don't listen to it on media, they will see it when they are protests. So they will ask, why am I not going to school? Because the teachers are on strike. Why am I not able to take my younger brother to hospital? The medical fraternity is in strike. So they're able to feel these things, but we are not having a conversation with them. So how do we expect them to change and be actively participating if we are not having these conversations with them? There was the issue of women graduating to other seats. So for women, legislators always say that for me to get half the recognition, I need to work twice as hard. And when that happens and you become comfortable in the quarter seat, because that you feel that is a safe space that is there. So how do we have, in as much as we want to go out and bring more leaders, can we also strengthen the ones that are already on those seats, so that whether they, in whatever means they came in, we are able to ensure that they have the skills that are needed and the technical know-how to move forward. Finally, I want to end on something a little bit controversial. We've been saying quite a lot that we need to ensure that the women leaders who are there are effective and efficient, and I agree 100%. But I am of the opinion that whether that woman is a thief, whether they have not learned, whether they are whatever name you want to place on them, can we ensure we get the numbers first? And then strengthen them so that they are able to now understand the power that they hold. Because that woman that we are saying is unable to efficiently perform, is expected to do some heavy community work, is expected to do unpaid care work. Of course, when it comes to where the money is, like the chef skills, then we have a whole conversation because the men then dominate that space. But can we ensure we get those numbers there? Once we have those numbers, then let's start to talk about now ensuring that we strengthen, not build capacity because they have the capacity. We strengthen their capacity. We ensure that they know the power that they hold and they know how to use it. Let's ensure that as we get in as many women as possible, regardless of whatever their qualifications are. Once they are there, we have educational institutions that can come in and offer short courses, not just on leadership, but on a wide range of issues. We have development partners who can come in, who can not just train, but expose you to different ideologies and different thought process. We've got the electoral commission that can then come in and say, so this is what you already have and this is how we are going to change it. And I say this is because for every time we say we have leaders there, but the women leaders who are there are not performing, why do we need to add more? That is already giving an excuse for the quotas to be removed. That is already saying that we gave you what you've wanted, you have misused them, so now we want to remove it. Or we want to now allow the men to qualify for those special quotas. So as we are having these conversations, I strongly feel that the conversation of there is no efficiency should be 1%. But the conversation of let's attain our numbers and then strengthen and build from there. Because we also equally have a lot of male leaders who are there and they will tell you, I don't even know what the finance bill is, and they're serving their second term. Who is talking about efficiency then? So I think these are the conversations we would need to have as well.
Thank you very much, Ruth. The more I listen to you, the more I'm unsure whether we are ready for Gen Z. You talked about having a conversation, which is the job Afrobarometer gets paid for. Every year they have a conversation with this whole continent, at least 40 countries out of the continent, about their sentiments, their feelings, their views on a wide range of governance questions. And I want to then use this opportunity to hear from Joe. What are we hearing? You know, what are we hearing in terms of, one, both women and young people, allow me to make that slight adjustment there, of satisfaction or otherwise with the kind of democracy that the continent is producing? And based on what we are hearing, what are some of the key reforms you think are urgent so that we do not all have to go to the Sahel to learn a lesson?
Great, thanks so much. And this has been so inspiring. I'm sitting here and taking down notes. I have learned a lot from the three panelists. I think I've been very lucky in that sense to have come here and learned quite a lot from them. So the things I would point out, and it also links to some of the issues that have just come up from these conversations across all the three presenters. So first of all, by and large, what we are learning from African citizens across the 40 countries that we work in is this sense of the barriers to women's engagement in political activity, especially when it comes to political participation in several dimensions. And of course, as rightly pointed out here, when you see that women's political participation, whether it is in community meetings or other forms of engagement, you see lower rates of participation. But of course, you can't discount the fact that other activities that engage women's time often leads to they not being able to participate more effectively. And as I spoke at during the first round of questioning, I talked about these gaps that exist. Complete care work, other issues that happen that women have to have divided attention to different engagements. Of course, that's undermine their ability to engage more fully in political activity, which is what we have seen in the data over time. In terms of reform that are needed, I'm glad that at least there was a talk about the institutions. So on the continent overall, there is this general dissatisfaction with the way democracy works on the continent. Even though people want democracy, they want their governments to be accountable, as I mentioned earlier. People are dissatisfied with the way democracy works. And whenever we see these trends coming up, it's often mostly concentrated with young people and especially young women who feel very dissatisfied with the way democracy works. And the source of dissatisfaction is actually on elections and the role of political parties. So first of all, when we talk about institutions and how to reform institutions, as rightly pointed out by my colleagues, without those reforms, whatever you do on the surface, we shouldn't be addressing the symptoms. We need to look at the institutional causes of some of the disparities and challenges that we have in terms of women's engagement. So political parties play a big role when it comes to engagement in active politics. And they play the big role in the sense that there's this gatekeeping that happens across all political parties. In what ways can we have women's meaningful engagement in political parties beyond, and in the morning somebody mentioned, why do we have women's wing or women's organizer, and then we don't have men's wing or men's organizers in political parties? And that is just one way of actually sidelining women in ways that does not allow them to have effective engagement in political party activity. And I think some reforms of our political party institute, the institution of political parties, need to be looked at. I would not see, and I completely agree with the young person who mentioned this in the morning, that having a women's wing or a women's organizer is just one mechanism that further undermines the way that women engage in politics. And I think some kind of reform there is needed to get that, to unlock that opportunity, those opportunities. The second is on elections. What we are seeing over time is when young people and especially young women feel that their vote does not count, and I'm glad that this was mentioned here, is you see them withdrawing from the electoral process. And so people who do not feel confident that their vote would count, and they don't trust the Electoral Commission, and they don't trust the electoral processes, they're more likely to withdraw. And that withdrawal happens more and more with young people, as I mentioned. And without some kind of reform that allows people to feel that their vote has an effect, that also undermines the ways in which we can have young people, young women being part of the political process and engaging effectively. So if I will prioritize, I think political party reform and electoral reforms will be the critical institutions I'll start with. Parliament and others are products of these institutions. And so the way in which we can unlock the institutional barriers to allow for women to be more effective in engaging and participating in political activity, whether it's becoming a president or becoming a member of parliament, is all a function of the political party organization as well as the electoral process and how it operates. The other point I want to mention, and which the Honorable Member of Parliament talked about, is gender-based violence. What we have seen over time, and the last time we asked this survey, it reflected in our flagship report, is what is the most important women's rights issue on the continent that Africans want their governments to address? And the first thing that came up on top is gender-based violence. And I'm glad that at least in Tanzania, there's this recognition of gender-based violence as an electoral issue, that when it happens, it has to be considered with the seriousness that it deserves. This has the strong backing of majority of African citizens. And my hope is that all countries would ultimately adopt this as part of the electoral code, that gender-based violence, majority of Africans say it is the topmost women's rights issue on the continent that should be addressed. And I hope that governments are listening to some of these numbers and will take that into account in thinking of addressing some of these disparities. And the final point I'll make is listening. Something came out about listening, whether or not leaders do listen. And that is one of the unfortunate things that we've seen in our data, that increasingly people feel that their leaders don't listen to them. And sometimes when you see, especially young people drifting and seeming like they are supportive of military rule or the military, it is partly because they feel that their leaders don't listen to them, and especially members of parliament. Because when I talk about listening to constituents, I think members of parliament do the poorest job in terms of how citizens view them. And I think now figuring out ways that would create opportunities for representatives, especially elected representatives, to listen to citizen voice and allow that to be part of their policy development, especially in the case that I've just mentioned, gender-based violence being a critical issue that people see as a topmost women's rights issue. I think that good listening leaders will take this into account as they think about some of the institutional reforms that I just outlined. All right, so I'll stop here. Back to you, Deus, and really enjoying this panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. So I must apologize to my panel. As much as I sounded so boastful at the beginning, I was reminded who the boss is. And I was reminded how much time I was given for this exercise. Before I lose my job and fail to go back home safely, allow me to propose a slight amendment. I was going to give you all an opportunity to share additional reflections, but I was told that that is me reinforcing patriarchy using women participants, because then we're allowing you to dominate the conversation, and that's one of the things we must address. If we are going to be inclusive, we cannot then have a lecture for all these wonderful thought leaders in the room. So we have to find a way for everybody here to feel part of our story. So I apologize in advance. I know you have a lot more to share, and we'll give you a final opportunity to do the wrapping up. But let me not allow this to end up into a lecture. So we're going to make a small transition where now we want to, as I promised in the beginning, hear from everybody from the audience on reimagining, reimagining inclusion and women leadership. And I must warn you in light of that sometimes we become experts in problems. We are so good at dissecting what the issue is, what the problem is, and the history and colonialism and everything that is wrong with our societies. And as activists, sometimes we fail in the business of selling hope. Somebody here asked what the populists do better than us. I think they do nothing better than that. They, the hustlers in the room, I think they understand what I'm talking about. The mamambogas from a country whose name I shall not mention. They sell hope, and they do it so well. And I think that's one thing that the rest of us ought to learn. How do we sell the hope of an alternative vision of society that addresses all these problems we've become experts in dissecting? And I think that's the challenge ahead of us. So we're going to spend the next 20 or so minutes in our tables to shift the conversation a bit. And that's what, when we come back to the panel, we're going to cement. One is, what are the strategies for, rekindling the souls of our ancestors that Marsha Balala explained very well in the morning, right? It's not enough for us to sit here and memorize and fantasize them if we have no clue how to rekindle those memories and those spirits. And maybe if we had done that at the airport, we would not have been caught the whole night, right? So that's the first challenge, all of us. How do we rekindle, women's agency in this transformation that we're talking about? The second question is concrete steps. It's one thing to talk about vision, and we can easily get drawn into daydreaming when we start analyzing our visions, and then we get caught into the train of paralysis by analysis. But how do we move from that into concrete strategies and steps that we are going to create to address the challenge that, again, Marsha Balala pointed to us in the morning, which is this Pan-Africanist women-led movement? What are some of the steps we're going to start to take now so that this Sawubona becomes, routine, so that next month maybe we'll be meeting in Zanzibar, talking about what progress we've made and how do we stick to our plan of action as presented by Honorable Ugangira earlier, right? And how do we continue on that momentum? Because as Masha Balala indicated earlier, there was a moment in time when there was very consistent Pan-African organizing. I don't want to call it Pan-Africanism, Afrocentric. That's a bit above my age for now. But just the concrete steps to collectivize our efforts. I think it's very, very important that we begin to imagine that before UN Women in International Idea help us design a Pan-African solidarity project, isn't it? So that's what we're going to talk about for the next 20 minutes on our tables. We'll even have some music to escort our thinking. I don't know if there's wine served. I wasn't part of that committee or any local brew for that matter. But you can look at your water, and as Isa bin Maryam once did when his mother ordered him, transform it and make it help you think. All right? So all the best, and we'll circle back in 20 minutes.